The transport skimmer hummed as it descended through the thin gray clouds, its hull streaked with the dust of a dozen worlds. Alien cadets pressed against the transparent canopy, craning necks and flexing tendrils and frills as the training grounds came into view below. The valley looked dead from above, a scar of pale stone and scrub stretching between two jagged ridges, with a black river cutting through the center like a crack in glass. No domes, no shining shelters, no support drones hovered in neat patterns. Only wind, rock, and a scatter of dark, insect-sized shapes that resolved into instructors standing in a line at the landing zone. In the middle of the jostling crowd, one human sat strapped into his harness, watching quietly while the others talked over one another. He did not try to get closer to the window. He marked landmarks instead, the way the river bent near a cluster of boulders, the faint smudge of what might be marshland to the east, the direction the sparse trees leaned under the prevailing wind. Every detail slid into place in his mind, forming an invisible map, while the skimmer dropped through pockets of turbulence that sent the cadets lurching and swearing in half a dozen languages. One tall, four-armed cadet named Vess clicked her mandibles in annoyance and twisted around to glare at him. "Human, you are supposed to be adaptable. How can you just sit there?" she demanded. He shrugged slightly, the harness webbing creaking. "I am adapting," he said. "I am watching." She hissed something under her breath, but she turned back to the window, gripping the frame as the skimmer finally flared its thrusters and settled into a blast of dust and grit that rattled against the hull like hard rain. The hatch cycled with a sigh, and heat poured in, dry and thin, carrying the scent of mineral dust and something metallic. One by one, the cadets shuffled down the ramp, some stretching wings, some flaring gills, some blinking wide, nictitating eyes in the unfiltered sunlight. The human stepped out last, squinting briefly before his pupils tightened. The sky was a washed-out blue, the sun a white coin that already felt hostile on his skin. The instructors waited on a raised slab of rock at the edge of the clearing. At the center stood Commander Ryal, whose species had no visible mouth, but projected a clear voice through a modulation collar. On either side of the commander stood a pair of silent aides with slates and recording drones. A ring of metal crates and sealed pods formed a perimeter behind them, locked and labeled. The cadets formed a loose semicircle, muttering among themselves as dust devils twisted by and dissolved. When the last footfall faded, the commander tapped a control on the collar, and a sharp tone cut across the murmurs. "Cadets of the Interstellar Survival Academy," the voice boomed, smooth despite the collar's synthetic timbre. "Welcome to your trial environment. For the next 30 standard days, you will live, forage, and protect yourselves within the boundaries of this valley and the surrounding ridges. No extraction, no resupply, no outside assistance." A ripple of unease passed through the group. The human listened without moving, his hands resting on the straps of his pack, his expression unreadable. He noted the duration, the boundaries, the lack of support. 30 days meant long-term strategies, not just a frantic scramble for calories. The commander's collar pulsed again. "As you know, each class faces a different constraint. This season's constraint is absolute and non-negotiable." A drone descended, projecting a hovering symbol, a stylized flame crossed by 3 hard lines. Cadets leaned forward. Some whispered guesses. The symbol rotated slowly. "The use of fire in any form is forbidden," the commander continued. "No open flames, no combustion-based devices, no plasma tools used outside of emergency medical protocols, and even those are modified to prevent sustained heat output. You will not cook, you will not burn, you will not signal with light generated by combustion. Any violation will result in immediate disqualification of the entire cohort." Silence rolled out from the rock like a shockwave. A few cadets actually flinched. The human's brows rose a fraction, but that was the only visible sign of surprise. He had expected something harsh. He had not expected an outright ban on one of the oldest tools his species had ever wielded. "That is impossible," Someone blurted out from the left side of the group, a slim cadet with deep green skin and bioluminescent freckles that pulsed anxiously. Our field manuals are built around controlled fire use, sterilization, cooking, predator deterrence. Your manuals are tools, not crutches, Commander Raal interrupted. You are future officers. You will operate in conditions where your assumptions fail. On certain worlds, fire attracts planetary-scale predators. On others, combustion taints sensitive ecosystems or ignites atmosphere pockets. You must learn to adapt without it. A heavier cadet with ridged horns folded his arms across his chest. Without fire, food spoils, raw meat crawls, fungi rot. We will be sick before the midpoint. A few nervous chuckles rolled through the crowd in brittle waves. The human felt a small, cold thread of curiosity replace his initial flash of worry. He looked at the crates behind the instructors again, imagining what was inside. Probably basic tools, maybe a handful of survival kits, sensor beacons to track progress, and nothing that would solve the main constraint. You have been issued standard starting rations, Raal said, as if responding to the horned cadet directly. They are sealed, non-combustion processed, and will last for a portion of the trial. The rest you will obtain yourselves. You are permitted to use solar, chemical, and mechanical energy. You are permitted to use your own biology. You are not permitted to create or sustain flame. Vess lifted her arms, all four hands splayed in outrage. Commander, with respect, this will devolve into starvation. How are we expected to sanitize water, to process unfamiliar plant matter, to keep parasites from multiplying in our stores? The commander's collar glowed a steady blue, signaling calm. You are expected to think. You are expected to cooperate. You are expected to use methods older and broader than the narrow window of combustion technology your cultures favor. The human caught the brief glint of the commander's gaze shift toward him, a small acknowledgement. The Academy had pulled him into the program precisely because his species had a long history of improvisation on worlds that did not care whether humans lived or died. He had grown up on stories of frost cellars dug into permafrost, of sailors packing fish in salt, of farmers hanging herbs in cool smokehouses where the fire never touched the food. He let the memory of those stories surface now, not as nostalgia, but as reference material. The instructors began distributing packs from the crates. Each cadet received one: a modular harness, a collapsible shelter sheet, a set of tools with all ignition functions stripped or locked, a water filter that did not rely on boiling, and a small block of compressed nutrient paste sealed in a translucent wrapper. When the human's turn came, an aide with slate-gray skin handed him his pack and locked eyes with him for a moment longer than strictly necessary. You will be watched closely, human, the aide said softly. Your species' record in these trials is unconventional. The human nodded. I understand. He shifted the pack across his shoulders, feeling the weight settle. It was lighter than he wanted. Not much metal, not many moving parts. Nothing he could not replace with scavenged scrap and bone if he had to, but it told him something about the Academy's expectations. This was not meant to be a gear-dependent exercise. This was meant to crack assumptions open and see what fell out. Once the last pack had been passed out, Commander Raal raised an arm. Your trial begins at local noon, the commander announced. You will have 1 standard hour to scout this immediate area and choose an initial camp location. Remember your boundary markers. Do not cross the ridge lines. Do not approach the eastern marsh until you have completed environmental scans. And remember the central rule, no fire. The projection above the commander's head brightened, the slashed flame symbol burning itself into memory more effectively than any lecture could. A chime sounded from the drones, and status lights shifted from ready blue to active amber. The trial had started. The organized semicircle dissolved instantly into clumps of movement. Small crews clustered around natural leaders, shouting suggestions and arguing over the best terrain. Some pointed toward the river, envisioning easy water access. Others gestured toward the higher ground near the ridge, muttering about vantage points and defensible positions. A few argued about scavenging the landing area for hidden caches, convinced the instructors had planted extra equipment. The human stepped away from the crush, adjusting his footing on the gritty soil. He crouched briefly, scooping up a handful of dust and letting it sift through his fingers. Fine, almost powdery, with larger grains beneath. Not good for clean footprints, but good for reading wind patterns. He turned his face into the breeze, tasting the air. Dry, but not sterile. There was a faint tang of organic decay under the mineral dryness carried from the direction of the river. That meant plant life, maybe even wetlands further downstream. Wetlands meant bacteria, insects, fish, and plants that had learned to live half in water and half out, often with interesting ways of protecting themselves. Food and danger braided together. Vess strode over, shadows from her forearms slanting across the ground. "Human," she said sharply, "you will join my unit. My species excels at structural engineering, and you have a reputation for odd ideas. We will need odd ideas." He straightened, dusting off his hands. "Fine," he said. "But if we are avoiding fire, we need to think several steps ahead. Short-term shelter and water are important, but food preservation will decide who ends this trial standing upright." Vess flicked her antennae. "Preservation? With no flame? You plan to simply eat everything as soon as you catch it?" "That works until it does not," he said. "Hunting luck fails. Weather changes. Stomachs revolt. There are other ways to make food last." She opened her mandibles as if to argue, then closed them again. "You will explain while we walk," she said instead. "We are taking the river route. My scouts already pushed a drone along the bank. There are overhangs and rock shelves that will work for temporary cover." As they set off with a small knot of cadets, the human glanced once more at the instructors on the rock. From this distance, Commander Raal looked smaller, the imposing figure reduced to a silhouette against the sky. The projection above the commander's head had vanished, but the rule hung over the valley more heavily than the heat. No fire, no comforting glow at night, no boiling water or crackle of brush, no simple way to wave away predators with a burning branch. His mind began to turn, not with panic but with the measured spin of a wheel picking up speed. He thought of vegetables submerged in brine until hostile microbes drowned and helpful ones thrived. He thought of narrow chambers where cool smoke curled slowly through hanging racks, leaving behind a faint protective coat that kept hunger from souring into illness. The Academy had ripped one tool out of his hands. Fine. His species had never survived on just one. While the others argued about camp layouts and cursed the rule under their breaths, he started counting stones near the riverbank in his imagination, measuring how much space he would need for pits and channels. The first chapter of the trial, he realized, was not about surviving without fire. It was about remembering everything that came before and after it. The riverbank the team had chosen turned out to be more complex than the brief drone sweep had suggested. As the group approached, the human noticed how the dark water braided into shallow channels near the shore, splitting around clusters of reeds that rattled in the dry wind. The ground dipped unevenly, shifting from hard-packed sand to soft mud in abrupt patches. Vess clicked her mandibles with irritation every time her feet sank unexpectedly, while her scouts fanned out to probe the terrain with metal rods. The cadets voiced concerns about shelter, fresh water, predators, and the lack of fire, all overlapping until the noise blurred. The human tuned out most of the chatter. He focused instead on textures, the thickness of the reeds, the presence of small burrows along the bank, the shade under the overhangs of layered stone. He had to think ahead, not about the next few hours, but about the coming days and eventually the weeks. Vess stopped at a flat section of rock that curved like a half bowl around a pocket of deeper water. "This is where we make camp," she announced. Her scouts signaled agreement, though some looked uneasy as they surveyed the sparse landscape. The human walked a slow circle around the chosen site, noting the height of the rocks, the reach of the shade, and the way the wind funneled between the stone ridges. The airflow mattered. It could preserve or destroy food depending on how intense it became. He crouched beside a patch of coarse grass and gently brushed his fingers against the blades. The scent of the crushed leaves was sharp and slightly bitter. That was promising. Some plants with bitter oils resisted spoilage. If he could gather enough fermented substitutes, those oils might enrich the mixtures. Vess stalked over to him. "Human, do not wander off. We need everyone to help build the first shelter frame." He rose and dusted off his palms. "The shelter matters, but we need food strategies immediately. The rations will not last long if we divide them evenly." She huffed, her antennae twitching. "We will forage. There are insects and roots here. We can eat as we find them." He gave her a measured look. "Eating everything fresh is fine until the first stretch of bad luck arrives. We need stored food that can last without cooking. Fermentation is one option." She stared at him as if he had suggested eating rocks. "Fermentation? That is rot." He shook his head. "Rot is uncontrolled decay. Fermentation is controlled. You guide which microbes do the work." She recoiled slightly. "You want to cultivate microbes?" He gave her a small smile. "You will appreciate them when you are not hungry." Before she could object further, he walked toward the nearest reed cluster. He kneeled by the waterline, selecting long, hollow stalks. The reeds bent smoothly in his grip, flexible but strong, and their inner pockets would help hold air or water depending on how he prepared them. He cut several lengths with his dull tool, then tied them together with fiber strips pulled from the broken edges of broader leaves. The result was a crude but functional strainer. He dipped it into the shallower currents, scooping up small aquatic plants, silt, and tiny organisms. After a few passes, he had enough material to begin sorting. Vess approached again, but this time she kept her voice lower, less commanding. "Explain what you are doing." He spread the wet material onto a flattish rock warmed by the sun. "Some of these plants contain natural sugars. Others carry bacteria that break those sugars down into acids. If we seal them with water and let them sit long enough, the acids prevent the growth of harmful microbes." She scratched the rock surface with one claw. "Acid as a preservative?" He nodded. "It works on many worlds. Different plants, same principles." She folded all four arms. "You sound certain." "I have done it before," he said simply. The cadets continued constructing the shelter, raising a frame from branch-like stones locked together with corded fibers. The human watched their progress briefly before returning to his own task. He needed containers. The limited gear included 2 small pouches and 1 flexible canister that could hold water but not seal it from the air. That meant improvisation. He searched the riverbank until he found broad pieces of bark, thick enough to shape yet not too brittle. Some had already curled from age, forming natural troughs. With careful cuts and pressure, he folded the bark into rough bowls, securing the seams with strips of reed fiber twisted tightly. He then dug a shallow pit and lined it with more bark slabs to keep water from seeping into the soil too quickly. As he worked, another cadet, a thin, feathered woman named Hress, tiptoed toward him. Her feathers trembled in the breeze, giving her an anxious appearance even when she stood still. "You are making containers?" she asked quietly. Her voice had a melodic hum. He nodded. "Fermentation vessels. Not perfect, but they will work long enough for what we need." She crouched beside him, her talons gripping the edge of the rock. "I have seen my elders preserve fruit in enclosed pits using salt water. Is this similar?" He looked up with a flicker of interest. "Very similar. Salt, brine, fermentation, different paths to the same result." Her feathers lifted slightly in a gesture of approval. "You should teach this to the unit. Some will resist, but hunger will persuade them." He began filling the bark containers with the strained plant mix, adding water from the river that he had already filtered through layers of sand and grass. The water was not perfectly sterile, but it was clean enough for this purpose. Fermentation did not require clean water. It required the right balance of microbes competing for dominance. He packed the containers tightly, pushing the plant matter low, then weighted the tops with smooth stones. A few cadets passing by wrinkled noses at the sight and smell, but Hres stayed beside him, helping adjust the stones so no plant matter floated above the water's surface. "If anything breaks the surface," he explained, "it will rot instead of ferment." She nodded, absorbing every detail. While the first containers began their slow chemical transformation, he shifted to the next step, gathering vegetables and roots with higher starch content. He spotted clusters of short, bulbous plants growing near the bank. The bulbs were mottled purple and green, a coloration that suggested either toxicity or nutrient density. He used his knife to cut one open. The interior exposed crisp flesh with a faint, earthy scent. He touched it lightly to his lips, waiting for tingling or bitterness. Nothing. He chewed a tiny sliver and tasted mild starch with a hint of sweetness. That was good. He harvested several bulbs, then gathered bitter leaves from nearby shrubs to help balance the flavors. Back at the temporary camp, the cadets had nearly completed the shelter frame. Vess marched toward him, bristling with impatience. "Human, we need hands. The shelter is unstable without proper weight distribution." He nodded. "I will help in a moment. First, let me finish preparing this second fermentation batch." She stiffened. "You are prioritizing plants in jars over our safety?" He met her stare calmly. "Without preserved food, this shelter will house starving cadets in 8 days. With preserved food, this shelter will house a team capable of making long-term plans." She opened her mandibles again but could not form a counter-argument. Hres stepped in softly. "He is right. This is essential." Vess glared at both of them before spinning away to organize the others. The human set up a second group of bark containers in the shade beneath an overhanging rock shelf. He sliced the bulbs, layered them with crushed bitter leaves, and added water to create a mild brine. This mixture would take longer to ferment, but it would produce something edible even if slightly sour. As he worked, he noticed how the cadets' murmurs gradually shifted. First there had been skepticism, but now he overheard curiosity. Questions, not objections. Several cadets approached cautiously, drawn by the sight of the makeshift vessels arranged neatly in rows. A horned cadet with a booming voice knelt beside him. "Human, will this food actually last? Without fire, without cooking, will it remain safe?" The human nodded. "Yes, the acids produced will protect it. Some of it will taste strange at first, but you will grow used to it." The cadet grunted. "If it keeps stomachs full, taste is secondary." Another cadet chimed in, a short, scaled woman with bright golden eyes. "Can this process work with meat?" He shook his head. "Not safely. We will need a different method for that." She tilted her head. "Smoke?" He shook his head again. "Not smoke as you know it. Something colder." She narrowed her eyes. "Then that will be our next challenge?" He placed the final stone on the last container. "One of many challenges," he said. By the time he rose to join the others at the shelter, the sun had dipped toward the ridgeline, casting long shadows that seeped into the cracks and folds of the rocky terrain. The cadets stepped back from their structure, a wide, tent-like frame of interlocking branches and fibers anchored between two natural pillars. It would hold through the night. As the human approached, Hres gestured toward the freshly stacked bark containers resting in the cool shade. "We will guard these," she said. "Some cadets are impatient, others are hungry already, but we understand their value." He nodded to her with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. In 2 days, the first batch will be ready. In 5, the others should stabilize." Vess overheard him and strode over, her antennae quivering with restrained curiosity. "So soon?" He nodded again. "Fermentation works quickly in warm climates." She tapped one of the stones resting atop the bark container. "Then we will test it when the time comes." Her tone carried reluctant respect. As the first night settled over the valley, the camp grew quieter. The cadets gathered to conserve warmth and morale. Without firelight, the darkness settled deeply, broken only by faint bioluminescent glimmers from certain alien skin patterns. The human sat on a flat rock near the shelter entrance, listening to the river and the night sounds. He thought of the containers hidden in the shadows, quietly transforming their contents. It would not be enough to feed everyone for 30 days. But it was a beginning, one that could turn desperation into strategy. The fermenting plants bubbled softly in the dark, and he imagined the tiny, invisible armies at work within each vessel. Those armies were old allies of his species, ancient partners in survival. He felt something like confidence settle into his chest. Fermentation was only the first stage. Tomorrow, he would begin the next. The first night along the river passed without disaster, but it did not pass quietly. The cadets woke repeatedly, stirred by strange noises in the dark, by movements in the reeds, by splashes in the deeper water, and by the unsettling awareness that without fire, nothing separated the camp from whatever prowled outside the shelter. By dawn, the mood had curdled into unease. Some cadets whispered complaints, while others blamed the terrain, the instructors, or the trial itself. The human, however, woke before sunrise with a growing sense of urgency. He felt the subtle shift in the air, as if something large had passed by the camp during the night. The river's edge bore shallow prints near the mud patches, prints too broad for any small creature and too deep for something harmless. He crouched to examine one of the impressions before anyone else noticed it. The print had a wide heel pad and 3 forward-facing toes tipped with something sharp. The edges were crisp, not softened by time or wind. That meant the creature had walked through during the night, not long before dawn. Hress approached him silently, her feathers still puffed from lack of sleep. She knelt beside him, tracing the edges with one delicate claw. "This is no river grazer," she whispered. He nodded. "No. It moves on 3 toes like a predator. It must have been scouting." Hress's feathers trembled. "Did it come for the food?" He glanced toward the shaded cluster of bark containers. "Or for us?" Before she could speak again, a horned cadet stomped closer, yawning loudly. His voice carried across the clearing. "Human! What are you inspecting now?" The human rose slowly. "Tracks. A large creature passed here during the night." The cadet leaned in, frowning. "So? Animals move. This world is full of them." The human met his eyes. "This one came close to our camp. Too close." That silenced the cadet for a moment. Then murmurs spread across the temporary camp like ripples in water. Vess strode toward the group of cadets forming around the tracks, her mandibles set in irritation. "What is the commotion?" she demanded. The human pointed to the prints. "A predator passed by. It is not afraid of us." She tilted her head, examining the shape. "It did not attack." He nodded lightly. "Not yet. It was gathering information." Vess stared at the prints a moment longer, and for the first time since the trial began, her confidence wavered. She recognized the implications. A predator bold enough to approach silently was a predator bold enough to return. She turned toward the rest of the cadets. "No one travels alone," she declared. "We stay alert. We reinforce the shelter." But reinforcing the shelter would not solve the food-related problem lurking beneath the tracks. The human knew that once the fermenting containers began producing stronger scents, predators might become even more curious. He had to start reducing the camp's scent signature, and soon. By midday, the sun beat harshly on the land, drawing long, shimmering waves from the rocks. The cadets gathered roots, insects, and edible plants, but the tension of the morning lingered in their voices. Every snapping twig caused flinches. Vess tried to maintain order, but even she kept glancing toward the ridge line, her antennae twitching for signs of movement. The human spent most of the morning scouting the area around the shelter. He climbed a low rise overlooking the river and studied the terrain. Tracks appeared again, faint, scattered, but consistent. The predator had circled widely, testing the perimeter. He measured the stride with his fingers, estimating a creature perhaps half his height at the shoulder, but with enough weight to topple an unguarded food cache. He could not yet risk building anything that produced even a hint of heat or visible smoke, but he could prepare the first steps toward scent control. He returned to camp with bundles of moss, reeds, and long filaments of fibrous bark. Hress saw him approaching and hurried over. "What will you do?" she asked quietly. "We cannot fight a predator in the dark." He shook his head. "We will not fight it. We will make our food harder to smell. Fermentation helps, but it is not enough." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Without fire, how can we mask the scents?" He looked toward the ground, then toward the riverbank where the wind shifted subtly. "By trapping them, diverting them, and hiding the strongest sources." He kneeled beside the rock shelf where the bark containers rested in the shade. The fermented mixture had begun to bubble noticeably, emitting faint sour aromas. Several cadets recoiled when they caught the smell, but the human smiled faintly. "That means it is working," he said. He layered damp moss around the containers, pressing it against the bark to create a natural barrier. Moss absorbed scent and insulated the containers from temperature swings. He wove reeds across the top, creating a loose mat that allowed airflow while reducing direct exposure. Hress helped weave the reeds into thicker sheets, her nimble fingers moving quickly. When the cadets asked questions, Vess observed the progress with increasing interest. "This will reduce the scent?" she asked. He nodded. "It will help, but not for meat. When we start dealing with meat, the scent will be stronger." A few cadets exchanged nervous glances. The horned cadet folded his arms. "So we are supposed to eat only plants? Insects? Worms?" The human shook his head. "Meat is possible. We just need a method that uses no fire and produces no heat." A scaled woman stepped forward. "Smoke without heat?" Her voice carried both skepticism and curiosity. He glanced at her. "Exactly. But we cannot build it yet. We need to test something first." Later in the afternoon, as the camp stabilized and the shelter stood firm, he ventured slightly farther along the river with 2 volunteers, Hress and the scaled woman. They moved carefully, speaking little. The river narrowed ahead, pressing through rock formations that created small pools and eddies. Insects buzzed in tight clusters. Strange fish with translucent fins rippled beneath the surface. The human pointed toward a series of deposits near the waterline, strips of pale material carried downstream. "These are mineral deposits," he said. "If we grind them and mix them with plant fibers, we can seal containers more tightly." The scaled woman crouched and picked up a chunk. "It is soft." He nodded. "Soft now. But when mixed and dried, it becomes dense. It will help block scents." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "How do you know all this?" He shrugged. "Experience, stories, trial and error." Hress gave him a small, amused chirp. "Mostly trial and error, I think." He smiled at that. As they gathered the mineral deposits, they heard a sudden splash upstream. The 3 of them froze. The scaled woman's eyes narrowed sharply. Hress drew closer to the human, her feathers trembling. The human motioned for silence. He crouched by the rocks, staring at the water's surface. Ripples expanded outward as if something large had waded through. A moment later, reeds on the opposite bank rustled. The sound was brief, no more than a brush of movement, but it carried weight. The human stayed perfectly still, listening. After several long seconds, he whispered, "It is watching us." Hress swallowed. "The predator?" He nodded once. The reeds continued shaking faintly, then stilled. The human did not see the creature, but he felt its presence. It was testing boundaries. It was adjusting its own strategy. The three gathered their supplies and slowly retreated toward camp, careful not to make sudden movements. Only when the shelter came into view did Hres release a shuddering breath. Back at camp, Vess sensed the tension immediately. "What happened?" she asked in a controlled tone. The human set down the minerals. "The predator is closer than we thought. It is not afraid of the river or the camp." Vess bristled. "Then we must prepare defenses." He shook his head. "Defenses are important, but the strongest defense is reducing what draws it." Vess stared at him. "Our scent." He nodded. "Food first, then us." The cadets gathered in a tense circle as he explained the next steps. "We must start building storage pits farther from the shelter. Fermented food must stay shaded and hidden. When we start working with meat, we will need a structure that moves scent through long tunnels." Vess frowned. "Tunnels?" Hres spoke softly. "He means a dryer, a cold smoke dryer." The human confirmed with a nod. "But for now, we start with concealment." The cadets worked into the evening, digging small pits, lining them with bark and reeds, and sealing the tops with mineral paste. The human guided each step, ensuring the pits were positioned downwind from the shelter. He walked the perimeter repeatedly, checking tracks, measuring the distance between predator prints and the camp. Each time he returned, his expression grew more focused. When night fell, the cadets gathered inside the shelter, shifting uneasily in the darkness. The human remained near the entrance, listening to the night. The reeds swayed, the river murmured, and somewhere beyond the dim outline of the rocks, something moved, softly, slowly, deliberately. He felt no panic, only preparation settling deeper into his mind. The predator would return, but so would he. Before dawn even touched the valley, the human left the shelter with the quiet certainty of someone who already knew what needed to be done. The air held a damp chill, and the river's surface glimmered faintly in the early half-light. He walked along the bank, checking the pits and the moss-wrapped containers, making sure nothing had been disturbed during the night. The predator had circled the camp again. Its prints were fresh near the reeds, faint but unmistakable. Yet nothing had been taken. That would not last. The scents would grow stronger as the fermenting mixtures matured, and once the cadets began hunting larger creatures, the danger would multiply. Hres emerged from the shelter soon after, rubbing her eyes with the back of her feathery hand. "You are awake early," she murmured. He nodded slightly. "There is too much to do." She followed his gaze to the edge of the river bend, where the prints disappeared into the brush. A shiver passed through her feathers. "It watches us." He crouched beside a stone, examining the direction of the tracks. "It is testing boundaries. We have to stay ahead of it." As the sun rose, the cadets crawled out of the shelter, their moods gray and sluggish. Vess marched toward the human, her antennae already angled with impatience. "Today we reinforce the camp," she announced. "We will make noise barriers and stake the perimeter." The human met her gaze evenly. "You can do that, but I must begin something more important." She frowned. "What is more important than securing the shelter?" He pointed toward the shaded area where the bark containers rested. "Preserving meat, hiding its scent, masking everything the predator wants to smell." She stiffened. "You want to work on that now?" He nodded. "We do not have time to wait. When we start hunting, we will have only hours to protect what we gather. We need a way to dry meat without heat." Hres folded her arms, intrigued. "A cold smoke dryer," she said softly, recalling the earlier conversation. He confirmed with a small incline of his head. "I have the designs in mind, but I need materials." Vess studied him for a long moment, her expression torn between skepticism and responsibility. Finally, she exhaled a sharp click. "Fine. Take 2 cadets with you. The rest of us will stay here." He nodded once, grateful for her reluctant trust. He chose Hress and the Scaled Woman. Both had steady hands and sharp senses, and both showed interest rather than fear when the predator approached the perimeter. The three left camp with tools slung across their backs, moving toward the ridge near the north side of the river, where scattered boulders broke the landscape into narrow corridors. The human paced slowly, seeking something specific. He had studied the wind the previous day. He had watched how it curled around the stones, how it moved along the slope. A cold smoke dryer required airflow, but controlled airflow. He stopped near a long fissure running between two tall rocks. The wind funneled through it in a steady, low whisper. The Scaled Woman crouched beside him, her golden eyes tracing the crack. "This is where you want to build it?" He nodded. "This ridge protects us from the sun. The wind moves predictably here, and the ground is dense enough to hold tunnels." Hress tapped her talons lightly on the rock. "How deep must we dig?" He pointed to the upper end of the slope. "The smoke source goes there, buried. A deep pit where wood can smolder with almost no oxygen." He traced a line with his hand down the slope. "The tunnel runs here, long and narrow, so the smoke cools as it travels." He pointed to the base of the ridge. "And the chamber goes here, a sealed space where the meat hangs. Only cold smoke enters, nothing hot." The Scaled Woman tilted her head. "But you cannot use fire." He shook his head. "Not fire, smoldering. Controlled decomposition. The wood should not burn, just smoke." Hress raised her feathers in nervous confusion. "How do we start smoldering without fire?" He lifted a piece of bark from his pack. Inside were embers, still glowing faintly, collected from a lightning-struck tree he had found upstream earlier in the morning. "The instructors forbade making fire," he said, "not using what nature provides." Hress stared at the glowing ember with wide eyes. "You are either clever or reckless." He smiled faintly. "Both, usually." Construction began at once. The human marked the ground with shallow grooves, tracing the outline of the smoke channel. He used a sharpened stone to slice through roots and exposed soil. Hress and the Scaled Woman cleared debris, piling rocks to serve as structural supports. The slope was ideal, angled enough to allow smoke to travel downward naturally. They dug for hours, sweat soaking into their clothing despite the cool ridge shadow. The soil resisted in dense layers, packed with ancient minerals. Occasionally, the human paused to measure the depth with his arm. "It must be long," he explained. "Too short, and the smoke stays hot." The Scaled Woman nodded, her hands coated in dust. "And the meat will rot instead of dry." As the sun climbed, Vess arrived to inspect their progress. She was flanked by two cadets and wore an expression caught between disbelief and begrudging admiration. She paced along the length of the shallow trench. "You plan to build a tunnel here?" He nodded without stopping his digging. "Yes." She peered down the slope. "And the chamber?" He gestured toward the base of the ridge where Hress was shaping a crude entrance. Vess inhaled sharply, her voice tight. "This is more work than I expected." He looked up at her. "Anything easy is eaten in the night." She stared at him, her mandibles clicking slowly, then finally nodded. "We will send more cadets. This must be finished before sunset." She left to gather reinforcements. With more hands joining, the pace quickened. The human organized everyone efficiently. Some widened the pit at the top of the slope, others deepened the tunnel, and a third group shaped the chamber at the base. The cadets' earlier tension eased as they worked together. Physical labor calmed nerves and focused minds. By late afternoon, the structure took shape. The pit was deep and narrow, supported by stones and layered with damp earth to prevent heat escape. The tunnel stretched long and slightly curved, reinforced with interlocked branches and mud paste. The chamber at the bottom was shaped like a small hut made entirely of stone and compressed soil, with hooks carved from branches embedded in its roof. The human inspected every section meticulously. He pressed the walls, checked airflow with a handful of dust, and adjusted angles. Slow, he murmured. It must be slow. Hres crouched beside the chamber entrance. Will this really preserve meat? He nodded. If we keep the smoke cool, the meat will dry safely. The scent will be faint, too faint for most predators to notice. Vess watched him from the ridge, her forearms crossed. And the smoldering? How do we keep it hidden? He looked up. We bury it deeper. The pit will trap most of the scent. The entrance is far from camp. No bright light, no flames, nothing to violate the trial's rule. She exhaled in relief. Good. We cannot afford a mistake. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, the human placed the ember into the pit, covering it with damp moss, green wood shavings, and strips of bark. A thin ribbon of smoke began to rise, barely visible, almost unnoticeable. It drifted into the tunnel, snaking downward. Hres watched the curl of smoke with fascination. It is cold already, she whispered. He nodded. It is ready. The chamber filled slowly, the smoke turning from invisible to a faint bluish haze. The human tested the temperature with his hand. Cool. Perfect. The cadets gathered around, awestruck. Vess stepped forward. When we have meat, we can use this? He looked at her firmly. Not just meat. Fish, roots, leaves, anything that benefits from drying. This dryer will keep us fed longer than any shelter. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke through the rocks, clean, cool, controlled. For the first time since the trial began, the cadets looked around the valley not with fear, but with possibility. Night closed in, and the predator moved silently beyond the ridge, testing scents on the air. But for the moment, there was nothing here to draw it closer. The cold smoke dryer was built, and the human strategy was only beginning. By the time the cold smoke dryer had settled into the landscape like a natural outgrowth of the ridge, the camp's rhythm had changed. Work and worry still filled every hour, but the panic had drained away, replaced by a tense, focused purpose. The human spent the first full day after construction testing the system. He adjusted the thickness of the moss over the smoldering pit, shifted the tunnel's lining where drafts formed, and watched how the smoke crept through the long, low passage before curling into the stone chamber at the bottom. Whenever the smoke flowed too fast, he narrowed a gap. Whenever it stagnated, he widened a crack. Hres stayed with him most of the time, learning how each tiny change altered the movement of the invisible river that now flowed beneath the ridge. On the second morning, Vess sent a hunting team out at first light. The cadets returned near midday dragging 2 river creatures, bulky animals with thick flesh and wide, flat tails. The horned cadet hauled one of the bodies alone, his muscles straining, while the scaled woman guided the second carcass with steady, efficient movements. Excitement crackled through the camp as the scent of fresh meat spread over the rocks. Hunger had sharpened every sense over the past days, and the cadets stared at the kills with open longing. Vess's antennae twitched as she approached the human. "You have your meat," she said. "Now show us whether your dryer will save us or poison us." He nodded once, accepting the challenge without flinching. "We begin immediately," he said. "The sooner the meat dries, the safer it becomes." He set up a preparation area near the riverbank, far enough from the shelter that blood would not linger around the sleeping ground. Hres, the scaled woman, and the horned cadet joined him. Together they skinned the creatures, peeling away the thick hides and setting those aside for future use as ground covers and windbreaks. The flesh beneath was pale and dense, with a faint mineral smell from a life spent in dark water. He cut the meat into long, narrow strips, as uniform as his dull tools allowed. The pieces had to be thin enough to dry evenly, but thick enough to retain strength and nutrition. Hres worked meticulously, matching his motions. She hummed quietly under her breath, a soft, instinctive melody that seemed to steady her hands. The scaled woman proved almost surgical in her precision. her claws sliced cleanly, following the grain of the muscle. The horned cadet, less delicate but just as determined, focused on hauling and sorting, arranging the strips in neat rows on flat stones. By the time the sun leaned past its highest point, an impressive mound of prepared meat lay ready. The human rinsed each strip in filtered river water and then rolled the pieces briefly in a mixture of ground mineral salt and crushed bitter leaves. The coating would slow bacterial growth and reinforce the protective layer that the smoke would later provide. Vess watched with tight-lipped concentration. "This is a ritual for your species?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not a ritual. A method. Rituals forget why something works. Methods remember." When the first batch was ready, he led the group to the base of the ridge. Cool smoke already seeped from the small opening of the chamber, barely visible in the shifting air. He ducked inside first, his shoulders brushing the stone. The interior was dim and close, but the air remained breathable. Smoke swirled around him, thin enough to see through but thick enough to coat anything that lingered. Hooks carved from branches and wedged into the chamber's roof waited overhead. He hung the strips of meat one by one, giving each enough space for air to pass between. Hres passed the pieces to him through the narrow entrance, careful not to touch the floor. The scaled woman counted the strips in a low voice, ensuring the distribution remained balanced. When the chamber was full, he backed out slowly and sealed the entrance with a slab of bark coated in mineral paste, leaving only a small vent at the top edge. The smoke continued to curl out, searching for the sky. Vess exhaled a long breath. "And now we wait?" He nodded. "We monitor. We check the dryness every day. We make adjustments." The horned cadet frowned. "And what about the predator?" The human pointed toward the ridge line. "The scent is scattered here. The smoke carries the smell upward and away. It will notice something, but not the concentrated lure of fresh meat." For 3 days, the camp followed a strict routine. Hres and the scaled woman rotated shifts at the dryer, checking the chamber and adjusting the smoldering pit whenever the smoke weakened or thickened. The horned cadet and a small team ranged out to scout and hunt smaller creatures, supplementing the diet with insects and roots. Vess coordinated the labor, splitting the unit into efficient work chains. The human moved between them all, tending the fermenting containers in the shade, inspecting the storage pits, and fine-tuning the dryer. On the 3rd night, the predator finally came. The cadets woke to a low, throbbing growl vibrating through the rocks. The sound rolled along the ground like distant thunder. Hres's feathers snapped upright. Vess surged to the shelter entrance, mandibles bared. The human was already outside, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the dark ridgeline. Moonlight washed the valley in silver, turning the river into a ribbon of cold light. A shape detached from the taller shadows near the reeds, a hunched, powerful body moving with deliberate grace. The creature stepped into clearer view. It stood low to the ground on 3-toed feet, just as the prince had suggested, with a long torso and a narrow head lined with short, curved horns. Its eyes reflected the moonlight like twin chips of ice. It sniffed the air, head swinging slowly from side to side. The cadets tensed, gripping crude spears and tools. Hres whispered, "It is hunting." The human shook his head softly. "It is searching." The predator paced along the riverbank, passing within 20 paces of the camp. It paused near one of the old scent patches where raw meat juices had soaked the soil. There it lingered longer, nostrils flaring. But the smell was faint now, overpowered by the mineral paste and fresh layers of clean mud the human had ordered spread over the ground. The creature snorted once, dissatisfied, and continued onward. When it reached the base of the ridge, the human held his breath. The cold smoke dryer lay hidden behind the stones, its entrance sealed. Smoke drifted upward in wisps that only a trained eye would notice. The predator lifted its head, sniffed, and turned toward the ridge. For several long heartbeats it stood still, every muscle poised. Then it began to circle. It approached close enough that the human could see the subtle ripples beneath its skin as muscles coiled and released. It sniffed along the stones, tracing the faint trail of smoke. Finally, it reached the upper slope where the smoldering pit lay buried beneath layers of earth and moss. It pawed the ground once, then again, irritated by the confusing signals, smoke without flame, scent without accessible flesh. It snarled and slammed a forefoot into the soil, digging shallow furrows, but the carefully packed structure held. Only a dull puff of smoke escaped before the airflow stabilized again. The cadets watched in frozen silence. The horned cadet's knuckles turned pale around his spear. The scaled woman's eyes glittered with focused fear. Hress pressed one hand against the rock, steadying herself. Vess stood beside the human, her antennae locked in a rigid angle of concentration. At last, the predator gave a frustrated huff and turned away. It paced along the ridge, nostrils flaring as it tested the air. The faint scents of fermenting plants and distant stored roots drifted in the breeze, but nothing strong enough to justify risk. With one final growl, a rough, grudging acknowledgement of defeat, it slipped back into the reeds and vanished into the night. The silence that followed felt almost heavy. Then, slowly, noise returned to the camp. Someone exhaled too loudly. Hress let out a trembling laugh that sounded half like a sob. The horned cadet thumped the butt of his spear against the ground in a short, fierce rhythm. Vess turned to look at the human fully. For a moment, her usually sharp eyes softened. "It could not find the source," she said quietly. He nodded. "The scents are scattered, hidden, disguised. Hunger does not always win." The next morning, they opened the chamber. The inside of the dryer smelled dense and rich, layered with smoke and something almost sweet. The strips of meat hung darkened and firm, moisture drawn out slowly over days. The human tested a piece between his fingers. It resisted bending, then snapped cleanly. That was what he had hoped for. He tasted a sliver. The flavor was strong, salty, and faintly bitter, but safe. He chewed thoughtfully, then nodded once. "It is good," he said. "Safe." He handed samples to Vess, Hress, the scaled woman, and the horned cadet first. Each tasted the preserved meat with cautious anticipation. Hress's feathers relaxed one by one as she chewed, relief spreading across her face. The horned cadet swallowed and grunted approval. The scaled woman's eyes brightened. Vess chewed longest, evaluating. At last, she nodded. "This will keep us alive," she said. "This will let us plan beyond the next hunt." Over the next days, the dryer worked continuously. New strips of meat replaced the finished ones. The fermented plants matured in their shaded containers, providing sour, nutrient-rich additions to the diet. The camp's food stores grew instead of shrinking. The cadets' movements changed accordingly. Backs straightened, voices steadied. Laughter returned in small, cautious bursts. Even the predator's shadow over the valley seemed to lose some of its weight. When the trial's 30th day dawned, the valley felt different. The cadets moved with a practiced routine, checking the dryer, inspecting pits, reinforcing the shelter not from panic but from habit. The human stood at the ridge, watching the river with calm eyes. He had learned the subtle language of the valley over these weeks, the way the wind warned of changes, the way the insects fell silent when something large approached, the way the plants shifted color as seasons turned. He no longer felt as if he stood in a hostile testing ground. He felt as if he stood in a place that had accepted his presence because he had learned to negotiate with it instead of trying to dominate it. The transport skimmer arrived just before noon in a swirl of dust and wind. The cadets gathered in the clearing while the instructors disembarked. Commander Ryal stood at the front, posture as composed as the first day. The modulation collar flickered as the commander surveyed the camp. There was no smoke rising from open fires, no scorch marks on the rocks, no scorched pits. Instead, the visible signs of survival took other forms: neatly arranged pits, shaded fermentation zones, carefully disguised storage, and the subtle dark mouth of the cold smoke chamber at the base of the ridge. Raal's gaze lingered on that last one for a long moment. The commander's voice carried clearly when the collar activated. Cadets, your trial has concluded. You have survived 30 days under constraint. The commander glanced at the aide's slate, then continued. Environmental sensors recorded repeated predator proximity. Nutrient analysis shows minimal deficiency in your group. Food waste remained low. Scent signature was significantly reduced compared to previous cohorts. Vess shifted slightly, pride tightening her stance. The human said nothing, but he felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. Raal gestured toward the ridge. Explain this structure. Vess started to speak, but then stopped and turned subtly toward the human. That small gesture did not go unnoticed. The commander's gaze followed the motion. Human, the commander said. This was your design? He stepped forward. Yes, Commander. A cold smoke dryer, no open flame. The heat source remains buried and minimal. The chamber receives only cooled smoke. Raal studied him. You preserved meat without violating the fire rule. He nodded. Along with plant fermentation and scent control. Fire is not the only way to keep food safe. One of the aides tapped at the slate. Data confirms low bacterial risk in preserved samples, the aide reported. Methods are efficient. Resource use remains sustainable. Raal's collar glowed softly as the commander looked over the assembled cadets. This cohort has performed above average under constraint. However, one element stands out. The commander fixed the human with a measuring stare. Your contributions altered the outcome of this trial significantly. Without fermentation and scent-managed preservation, the predator would have found more to hunt. The horned cadet stepped forward unexpectedly. Commander, he said, voice rough but earnest. He did more than that. He changed how we think about survival. He made sure we did not rely on a single tool. Hress added softly, he taught us to trust methods we could not see, microbes, smoke, slow processes. The scaled woman nodded once. He showed us how to cooperate with the environment instead of trying to burn through it. Raal listened without interrupting, then inclined the commander's head. Acknowledged. The collar's tone shifted slightly as the next words came. Human cadet. Highest marks in adaptive thinking, resource management, and constraint compliance. You will receive commendation and advancement to the next level of training. The rest of you will receive marks proportional to your contribution and your ability to learn from methods unfamiliar to your own cultures. He felt the cadets' eyes on him. Some held open gratitude. Others showed respectful distance, a recognition of skill from those who prided themselves on strength. Vess approached and extended one hand, all 4 fingers spread in the greeting of her species. You were right, she said simply. Fire is useful, but not necessary. You gave us more than a way to eat. You gave us options. He took her hand briefly. I did not do it alone. You trusted me when it mattered. The instructors began recording detailed scans of the dryer and the fermentation setups. Raal turned once more toward the valley before reboarding the skimmer. The galaxy holds many worlds where fire is forbidden, impractical, or catastrophic, the commander said. After this trial, you are better prepared to face those worlds. As the skimmer lifted into the sky, dust spiraling in its wake, the cadets stood together at the riverbank. Hress looked up at the ridge where the dryer still sat quietly exhaling faint threads of smoke. Will you miss this place? She asked. He considered the question. I will remember it, he said. Every world that does not kill you teaches you something. This one taught us how to live without a flame. The wind shifted, carrying the mingled scents of smoke, stone, water, and faint sour tang from the last fermenting containers. The predator's tracks still marked the mud near the reeds, but those prints were already softening under the sun and breeze. The valley would erase them in time, just as it would erase the shallow pits and carefully assembled shelters. But the knowledge would remain, carried away in the minds of the cadets who had stood here and learned how to thrive in a place that stripped away one of the oldest tools of their civilizations. The human turned from the river and walked toward the waiting transport sled that would carry the cadets back to the academy. Behind him, the cold smoke dryer whispered its last thin breath of cool smoke into the air, a quiet monument to the idea that survival did not begin or end with fire. It began with understanding, with patience, and with the willingness to trust slow, unseen work, whether in microbes, in smoke, or in the steady hands of those who chose to build instead of burn.